Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts. Now, here's Jim Dubois.
The Republican Party swept the 2014 midterm elections, picking up many state gubernatorial seats, increasing the party's lead in the U.S. House of Representatives, and most notably, gaining control of the U.S. Senate. This month on Access Minnesota, we'll examine the midterm races with University of Minnesota political science professor Kathryn Pearson. We'll look at why voters favored the GOP in this election and how the Republicans will work with President Obama in the next 2 years. Kathryn Pearson is an associate professor of political science at the University of Minnesota. Professor Pearson, welcome back to Access Minnesota.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
The Republicans did extremely well in the past midterm elections. They gained control of the U.S. Senate and increased their majority in the U.S. House. Was this another wave election similar to what we saw in 2006, 2008, 2010, 2012?
Well, this certainly was a great election for Republicans. There's no doubt about that. I don't know that I would go so far as to call it a wave. Republicans gained seats in the U.S. House of Representatives, about a dozen. But actually, in midterm elections, the party of the president traditionally loses seats. In fact, there have only been a handful of exceptions since the Civil War, most notably 2002 and 1998 being two of them. But it's quite normal for the party of the president to lose seats. We did see a bigger loss than usual in the U.S. Senate, and of course with major consequences as Republicans took majority party control.
Are there any theories why the president's party does not fare particularly well in midterm elections?
Well, there are a couple different reasons. One is this theory of surge and decline. So in presidential election years, the party of the president typically does well because of the president's coattails. We certainly saw that in 2008 with Democrats picking up a lot of seats in the U.S. House and a few more in the U.S. Senate. 2012, again, a good year for Democrats. But then there's this decline in midterm elections. And that happens for the out party of either party, but it's particularly tough on Democrats. And that's because in midterm elections, voter turnout is typically around 20 points less than it is in a presidential election year. Furthermore, the drop-off is disproportionately among voters who tend to vote Democratic. So for example, younger voters and voters of color who were less likely to turn out in this midterm election.
What do you attribute the Republicans' victories to? Do you have any particular theories as to why the Republicans did so well?
Well, certainly President Obama's low approval ratings contributed to Republican gains. Republicans were more enthusiastic, more likely to show up at the polls. Again, the demographics of Republican voters meant that they're more regular voters in midterm elections. The other factor at work, at least in the U.S. Senate, was that there were some structural factors in Republicans' favor. Of the 36 U.S. Senate races, the vast majority of them were in seats previously held by Democrats. And so Democrats were on the defense while Republicans were on offense and able to pick up seats fairly easily.
Tell us about the messages that we heard this election coming from both the Republicans and the Democrats. Which were the major themes and which seemed to resonate best with the voters?
Well, certainly the Republicans were talking about Obamacare, as they have in the last few cycles, and found that that's been pretty effective. But it's actually not particularly effective among Democratic voters. I think really the messages we heard, including here in Minnesota, was that Republicans are simply that Democrats are simply tied to the party of an unpopular president. We heard over and over again that Democratic candidates, incumbents, vote with the president, 97% of the time or 98% of the time, whatever that number was for the particular race. Most Republican candidates were really trying to tie the Democrat, even those who weren't sitting in office, with an unpopular president. So that was a major theme. And in a midterm election, fewer independent voters are actually turning out, and so the issues are less likely to even sway voters. We know that at least 9 out of 10 voters are voting their party identification, not so much picking up on messages. But to the extent that we did hear about messages, it was Obamacare and tying Democrats to the party of the president.
Heading into the election, the polls were indicating that Republican candidates were faring quite well. Were there any outcomes, though, that surprised you in this election?
The outcome that surprised me most, I think, was the North Carolina Senate race. And that was clearly a toss-up race. It was very close, very competitive. In fact, it was the most expensive race in the entire country and in Senate history, with over $100 million being spent either by the candidates or parties or outside groups. And that was a seat in which Kay Hagan, the Democrat from North Carolina, was defending her seat with Tom Tillis, a Republican legislator, running against her. And the polls had it as a very close race, but Kagan had really distanced herself from the president and had a reputation as an independent and was certainly actually looking like she could hang on in the polls. But she was pretty soundly defeated on election night. So I think that one surprised me, despite the fact that we knew it would be close. The other race that surprised me was Virginia. Who knew it would be so close? The polls didn't indicate that Democrat Mark Warner would have such a hard time hanging on. And while he did hang on, it was a nail-biter for him.
Going into the election, the polls indicated that Republican candidates were faring rather well, but some of the races were supposedly going to be quite a bit tighter, according to the poll results. What does this say about the accuracy of the polls?
Well, polls are always a snapshot in time, and we'd like to think in 2014 they could be perfectly accurate, but it really depends on the response rate and who's answering their phone. Now, one advantage is that there are more and more polls, and so with more and more polls conducted, they can be aggregated to get better predictions, but nonetheless, people still have to pick up their phones. And in an age with cell phones and caller ID, it's harder and harder to get a representative sample of likely voters. And so what pollsters do is they understand the demographics of a state or district, whatever they're trying to assess, and then they weight their poll according to the respondents to try to make their poll representative of the sample that they're trying to really assess an outcome they want to predict. But it's increasingly difficult when you're waiting with so few young voters actually answering their phones and poll respondents being disproportionately older white women who vote Democratic.
Do we have any idea of how much money was spent during this past election cycle? And if so, how does it compare to previous elections?
Well, all the dollars are not in yet, but we do know that once again, as has been the case since 1998, this is the most expensive midterm cycle in history. And one of the reasons for that is outside groups are really spending more and more, again, with every cycle. The candidates are too, but the greatest increase is in outside groups. And some of these groups are spending what we call dark money, which means that their donors are not actually disclosed. Some, on the other hand, what are called super PACs, are spending money that actually is disclosed. But the thing with outside groups is that they actually, by law, are not allowed to coordinate with the candidates. And so they're running ads that are increasingly negative, and the candidates who are saying, I didn't run this negative ad, actually are being truthful in the sense that they really do have no control over the content. And so not only are the midterm elections becoming more expensive, they're also becoming more negative because of all the outside spending. And that's not just outside groups such as super PACs and 527s, but also the parties who are spending independently of the candidates and running very negative ads.
How big of an impact does the advertising from these outside groups have on the election itself?
Well, political scientists are definitely mixed on this question. Some research has shown that negative ads really mobilize a certain subset of voters, either to vote for their candidate or against the candidate that's being targeted. Other research has shown that actually these negative advertisements really turn off independent-minded voters or voters who are less likely to vote in every cycle because they get so discouraged with both sides. And so it's not a question of, how do negative ads increase or decrease turnout? It's a question of which groups are we talking about and how are they likely to be affected?
Voter motivation is always a key issue. Did the Democrats have a hard time this election cycle motivating their core to come to the polls?
There's no doubt that this was a tough election for Democrats, and not just for the structural factors that we've talked about, but because the president is not very popular. And with approval ratings hovering in the low 40s, Democrats just really couldn't get their voters as enthusiastic as they needed to be to come out and vote for the polls. And that certainly contributed to low turnout and to Republican victories in 2014.
Minnesota voters kept the state blue in the 2014 midterms while much of the country went red. When Access Minnesota returns, a look at why our state bucked the national trend.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Now more from political science professor Kathryn Pearson on the 2014 midterm elections and what we can expect during the upcoming state legislative session. If you look at a map of red versus blue states following the midterm elections, Minnesota still looks pretty blue. Why did Minnesota buck the Republican wave?
Minnesota, for several reasons, and I'll talk about the caveat of the fact that the Minnesota House of Representatives did switch parties, and Republicans gained majority party control in the Minnesota State House. But in general, it's because Minnesota had two strong Democratic incumbents running for re-election. And certainly, when they were both first elected, it would have been hard to predict that they would be strong incumbents running for re-election, because in the case of Senator Franken after the 2008 election and Governor Dayton after the 2010 election, they both won only after recounts. And in fact, Senator Franken by 312 votes, and he wasn't seated until July following the November election. So very close original elections. And in the case of Senator Franken, he was elected in a banner year for Democrats. And yet he held on by a good margin in a banner year for Republicans. And incumbency plays a major role in it. But it's not simply the act of being an incumbent and all the advantages that accrue to that in terms of name recognition and fundraising ability, but he really was very strategic in his 5.5 years in the Senate, focusing on issues important to Minnesota, traveling around the state, and really rejecting national media and national policies in favor of focusing on Minnesota media and Minnesota policies. And so he just was very strategic, was a serious legislator, and I think really surprised a lot of people who knew him as a Saturday Night Live figure and not a serious legislator. Coupled with the fact that his opponent did not have any electoral experience. And while certainly being an outsider has some appeal and some advantage, the bottom line is without a base of people who've already elected you into office and the political skills that come with that, it's even harder to defeat an incumbent. In fact, the vast majority of incumbents in Congress who are defeated by an opponent who already has had previous electoral office. In the case of Governor Dayton, he also enjoyed the advantages of incumbency. Now, he was first elected in a year that was terrible for Democrats and then re-elected by a much wider margin in a year that was terrible for Democrats. But again, with the power of incumbency and name recognition and being able to say, here's what I campaigned on in 2010 and here's how I met my campaign promises. And in fact, with DFL control of the legislature, Governor Dayton was able to really fulfill a lot of his campaign promises, including increasing taxes for the wealthy, dealing with education funding, and many other policies that Democrats favored. Now, some of these policies gave Republicans an in to campaign against him, but for the most part, he was able to really appeal to voters, especially Democrats, but also some swing voters, based on fulfilling his campaign promises.
Republicans gained control of the State House of Representatives, and immediately following the election, both Republican leaders and Governor Dayton said there would be a spirit of bipartisanship at the state capitol come January. How likely do you think it is that that will actually happen?
Bipartisan cooperation in a polarized environment is tough. That said, I think the two parties will come together and cooperate in a bipartisan way when it's in both of their strategic interests to do so. I think both parties would like to avoid another government shutdown. That was embarrassing and clearly difficult for many residents in Minnesota. So I think they'll try to avoid a shutdown. The other advantage there is that there's not the budget shortfall that we saw 4 years ago, and so it will be less difficult to find common ground. On the issue of transportation, the legislature didn't really finish transportation in the last session. I'm sure DFL legislators certainly wish they had when they had unified control of the State House. There are some transportation issues that really divide the two parties, mass transit for one, but on the other hand, I think legislators of both parties certainly like to bring transportation money back to their districts. So I do see some bipartisan cooperation coming up on transportation. But on social policy issues, on a lot of budget policy issues, the two parties really are quite far apart in terms of their ideas about what makes good policy. And so I think it will be much more difficult for a divided legislature to pass a lot of legislation this session.
Governor Dayton has said that he will not run again for governor, and we see that at least for the next couple of years we'll have a divided state legislature. How likely will it be that Governor Dayton will be able to promote a lot of his agenda given that divisiveness within the legislature?
It'll certainly be much more difficult for Governor Dayton than it was over the past 2 years with unified party control. There's no doubt about that. But I think he wants to leave a legacy, and so that will give him an extra incentive to work with Republicans, particularly around the issue of bonding and areas in which all legislators can gain something, as opposed to some of the more divisive social policy issues where the two parties really are divided and their bases of constituents are divided as well.
Following the national elections, both the Republicans and President Obama made statements saying they would work together in Congress to pass legislation. Again, how likely are we to see more bipartisanship in Washington moving forward?
I think increased bipartisanship is extremely unlikely. The two parties in Congress are so far apart on the major policy issues of the day. Add to that this extreme electoral competition between them. Certainly, Democrats want to retake party control of the Senate 2 years from now. I think everyone agrees that's less likely in the U.S. House of Representatives. And the spirit of the 2016 presidential elections is already upon us, just days after the 2014 midterms. And again, I think that both parties' bases feel very strongly about policy issues in the opposite direction. There are smaller areas in which the two parties can work together. Perhaps trade, where President Obama and Republicans can find some common ground, where some more liberal Democrats may disagree. Some very small issues concerning the Affordable Care Act, where the two parties can come together and work together. Medical device taxes, for example. But on the major policy issues of the day, they're just not going to be able to find common ground. And in fact, both parties are going to, unfortunately, want to make the other party look bad, as we've seen over the last couple of years.
In the Congress, the Republicans in the House lean more to the right than Senate Republicans. Will we see some intra-party skirmishes because of this? We will. And so the fact that Republicans now control both chambers of Congress will show some of these divides in ways that we haven't seen in the last few years. We'll see that with the strategy surrounding the Affordable Care Act. House Republicans have voted numerous times to repeal the entire thing, and now the Senate Republicans will be under pressure to do the same thing. But on the other hand, Republicans do have an interest in showing some policy alternatives and not just being the party of no, especially going into the 2016 cycle. Because now, since Republicans control both chambers, they have more responsibility to actually pass legislation that the two chambers can agree upon. Add to that the Senate filibuster, where most policy issues require 60 votes, not a simple majority of 51, to actually get enacted. And so that will necessitate some Democratic votes for Senate policies to get through. Senate Republicans have been criticized for their use of the filibuster. Now that the Democrats are in the minority in the Senate, will they likely employ similar tactics? And if so, what risks do they take by doing that?
Absolutely. And Democrats were most critical of Republicans when it came to filibustering the president's nominees. And so that, at least for the next 2 years, will be an issue where Senate Democrats will still be on the president's side and want the president's nominees to get passed. But certainly Democrats will not hesitate to filibuster policy issues that they disagree with, as they have in past Congresses where Democrats have been in the minority. What is interesting here, though, are the politics of filibuster reform. And certainly, when a party is in the minority, they are much less interested in filibuster reform than when they are in the majority. And we see that time and time again with individual senators and with party leadership on this issue.
With our lame duck Congress and some budgeting issues on the horizon, are we looking at the possibility of another government shutdown? How do you think this will play out going forward, both in the lame duck Congress and in the new Congress coming next year?
The current budget expires on December 11th, and so absent a new budget or a continuation of this year's budget, there would be a government shutdown on December 12th. That said, both parties have a strong interest in avoiding a government shutdown. It was embarrassing for Republicans the last time around. Certainly public opinion polls showed that the vast majority of Americans blame Republicans and not the president, and they want to avoid that. Now, that said, it didn't actually hurt them in the midterm elections, but budget shutdowns incur real pain on everyday Americans, and I think there's growing awareness of that. And again, it would suggest that early into their new status of controlling both the House and the Senate, even though the current Congress is still in operation, that Republicans weren't really ready to lead. And so I think there's a strong bipartisan interest in avoiding a government shutdown and passing some the spending bills, or at least an extension of them, to keep the government going. That said, there's some real issues where the parties disagree within these budgets. And I think the question for congressional Republicans is, do they deal with their opposition to President Obama's action on immigration, his executive action on immigration, within the appropriations process or in another way? And I think to avoid a government shutdown, they'll deal with it outside of the congressional appropriations process.
When Access Minnesota returns, more on President Obama's executive action on immigration and how it may affect his relationship with Congress.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Back to our discussion with political science professor Kathryn Pearson on Access Minnesota. On November 20th, President Obama announced his administration's plan to overhaul immigration by executive order, thus bypassing Congress. What message does this send to the Republicans, and is this an indicator of how the president plans to govern during the next 2 years?
Well, this is an issue where how you see this issue really depends on where you sit in terms of whether you support the president or congressional Republicans. Certainly, congressional Republicans are discussing the fact that it is the most expansive executive action in scope that we've seen, and Democrats are defending the president, saying that congressional Republicans have had the opportunity to pass immigration reform, send the president a bill, and they have not done so. And so both sides have their case to make, and public opinion on this is relatively divided as well. Now that Republicans control both chambers, they will certainly be able to take legislative action on immigration reform or to try to make it difficult to fund President Obama's executive action. But ultimately, this is an issue that's a little bit dangerous for both parties. And so I think President Obama has staked out his position, his executive action, but to continue with a lot more executive actions really could be problematic for him in the eyes of the public. Sort of this charge of the imperial presidency gaining more traction if there are more executive actions to come. That said, congressional Republicans face a real danger if they don't do anything on immigration reform and only criticize the president or try to sue him or strip him of his authority through a funding route with the executive action.
President Obama had threatened to use executive action for immigration reform prior to the 2014 midterm elections. He was urged not to do so by some Democrats who were fighting tough election battles. Did that delay in that process and his ultimate decision to use executive order to invoke immigration policy reform smack a little disingenuous to Latino voters? And could that have cost him some votes, or cost his party some votes in this past election cycle?
It certainly, if you read the comments of many Latino voters, and particularly organizational leaders, it did strike them as quite disingenuous and very politically crafted as opposed to genuine. And so given that everyone seemed to know that President Obama was going to take executive action on immigration, he would have been better off doing it before the election instead of doing something that everyone knew he was going to do, but then opening himself up to criticism for delaying it for political purposes. And it is certainly possible that having done this before the election could have really mobilized some Latino voters who instead stayed home. Now, would that have changed the outcome in some of these competitive Senate races or House races or state houses? I don't know, but in terms of politics, I think it really would have helped him with some important Latino constituencies.
A recent New York Times article pointed to efforts by the Republicans during this past election cycle to reach out to minority communities, to women, to recruit them as candidates for various state house races. And they had some degree of success with that. Do you think this is a new trend for the Republican Party to reach out to those groups which some say it is historically ignored?
Republicans are woefully behind Democrats when it comes to attracting voters of color, women voters, and certainly to an even greater extent, candidates of color and women candidates. If you look at the current House of Representatives, of the 79 women that serve, only 19 of them are Republicans. In the current Senate, of the 20 women that serve, only 4 of them are Republicans. And the numbers for representatives of color are dramatically worse. And so certainly Republicans have a lot of catching up to do. That said, the strategy of going the state pipeline route is absolutely the right one, because the state legislature is the best pipeline into the U.S. Congress. Most new members of Congress, certainly not all, but a majority, do come from the state legislatures, and state legislators have the best chance of defeating an incumbent or winning an open seat. We saw in the House of Representatives, Mia Love, the first African-American Republican woman elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. And so we do see some success among Republicans, but again, it's very slow. And frankly, the Democrats have been slow as well, but in the last cycle, we saw for the first time ever among Democrats in the U.S. House of Representatives, white men are now the minority in the Democratic caucus. And Republicans have a long way to go, but the strategy of focusing on state legislatures is certainly the right one to make important inroads there.
With the opposing party in control of Congress, what can President Obama do during his last 2 years as president to establish a legacy? How difficult will it be for him to advance any part of his agenda?
The most important thing that President Obama can do to really establish his legacy is to work on Obamacare. One, he needs to defend it from attacks from Republicans that he will certainly get in the form of legislation at his desk, and I'm sure he'll veto those bills. But I also think it would really help him to work with Congress to actually fix it in some important ways, because as long as he's president, it's here to stay. And although public opinion is quite divided on the Affordable Care Act, it is likely to be here even after President Obama leaves office, no matter who's president next. And so I really think it would be helpful for him to really make sure that it works going forward. The other issue certainly that we've been talking about is immigration, and how that plays out in the year to come with a battle in Congress, I think is important. I don't think it's likely that we're going to see major immigration legislation, but certainly really figuring out this executive action, and then if there's anything else moving forward the president wants to do on immigration.
Kathryn Pearson is an associate professor of political science at the University of Minnesota. Professor Pearson, always a pleasure to have you on Access Minnesota.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
That's all for this month's edition of Access Minnesota. We'll see you again next month. Thanks for watching.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.